come in while we're working. Hey, everybody, this is Andrew Sunfrog, sometimes known as Teacher on the Radio. And I'm here in Middle Tennessee on the east side of Nashville, and in Middle Tennessee slightly on the west side of Nashville. I'm joined by my friend Martin, and he came via the hippie movement of the olden days, and I'm obsessed with the 60s and hippies and communes and the Grateful Dead and all things related to spirituality and psychedelics. And I've written several oral histories related to that time period, including one on hippie Christians called Banjo and Bread. And I've had Martin on my list of people I want to interview for at least a couple of years. And we've been batting this idea back and forth. And we finally made it happen today on the first day of June, 2023. And it's a balmy day in Middle Tennessee in the 80s probably. And we're taking a break from working on our other projects to talk story. As they say in the Hawaiian Islands, they like to say we talk story. So, Martin, why don't you just first tell us a little bit about yourself and your introduction to the counterculture in the 1960s, and maybe bring us as far as to how you met Stephen Gaskin, but just a capsule of your involvement in the counterculture and however you define it. You know, I've studied the 60s a lot, but I was just a baby in my parents' arms during the late 60s. And so I have to rely on the stories that other will tell me. So welcome aboard to my live stream, Teacher on the Radio live stream. So Martin out of Nashville. Go ahead, Martin, take it away.
Okay. I was always kind of an outsider as a kid. Just being brought up Jewish in a mostly Christian environment. And my mother had been kind of part of the New York left-wing bohemian scene in the 30s. And so we'd go to her sister's house in New York, and the Village Voice would be on the coffee table. And, you know, there was a lot of interest in classical music and art. Her sister was also an art teacher and an artist, both her sisters, actually. And, you know, my mother, I was just brought up in a literary environment. Somewhat, you know, I.F. Stone's Weekly was something that arrived in the mail that I started reading in my early teens. I got motivated to go help our local civil rights movement canvas to get people to go out to vote in the mid-60s. I had a few friends in high school, and we kind of styled ourselves bohemian, and we're into William Blake and modern art and jazz, this kind of thing. And so, you know, and it was like when I looked at my college aspirations, I was thinking about Antioch or Goddard, which were kind of the two counterculture, maybe Reed on the West Coast, which were the main countercultural colleges in that time. And so I ended up going to Goddard right around the time the whole hippie movement started breaking loose, and LSD was sloshing around everywhere. And couldn't actually find any marijuana in Dayton in 1966, but there was plenty of it when I got to college, and took my first LSD right before Christmas in 1966. It was a sugar cube, and I think it was even still legal. And then the whole San Francisco thing broke, and I'd been involved with like liberal religious youth, Unitarian youth group, a lot. I'd split from Judaism because they just seemed like they wanted to be young businessmen and businesswomen. And the LRY was kind of hipper. And we'd go on retreats and talk about what kind of society would we start if we could start a society. And all of a sudden, all this stuff starts happening on the West Coast. And I'm reading I was in Montreal for a winter on a work-study program, and reading the San Francisco Oracle and saying, shit, I'm in the wrong place. So Goddard being a fairly loose college, I arranged to spend some time on the West Coast studying the counterculture, and got out to California in late 1968. Let's see. No, I got there in early 1968 first for about 6 weeks, a couple months on the, and just like dropped into Haight-Ashbury and found some people to crash with and sold newspapers on the street and panhandled and had a pretty good time. Decided to come back and went back that next fall as a and kind of immersed myself in Berkeley and San Francisco. And then right before that happened, my best friends, two of my best friends in college got married in Washington, D.C. And I was working, and this is the summer of '68, the summer of the Chicago riots, and I didn't get to that, but it made a very deep impression on me, and I decided looked like the worst troublemakers in the world were clean-cut white guys in suits, and I wasn't into doing anything about I couldn't do anything about being white, and I didn't want to do anything about being a guy, but you couldn't really do much about it then anyway. But I could sure as heck never wear a suit and not be clean-cut. And so that's where I started growing my hair. But anyway, I met a young woman at my friend's wedding, and I was going out to San Francisco, and she was going out to San Francisco. And she said, well, let's meet on the West Coast. And that sounded kind of cool. So we met on the West Coast, and about the first thing she said to me was, I've got this really amazing class at San Francisco State College. It's called Monday Night Class. You ought to come to it. And I went to it, and it was a couple hundred people. And I looked around and felt the vibes, and I checked out various people doing various communal things, and it was like, But this time I got in this room with these people, and I thought, this feels like the people I came to California looking for. And then Steven started to talk, and it just blew my mind because I'd been thinking along the same lines he was. I was reading, what such Eastern wisdom as was available back in those days, which wasn't much, and Carl Jung and Wilhelm Reich and Herbert Marcuse and Norman O. Brown, all that kind of thing. And Stephen had taken all that so many more steps down the road than I had that I was quite happy to hear him help him hear him make sense of the world for me. He just had a lot of tools. He always said, I'm teaching people to be teachers here. I'm not trying to be your guru. I want you to be able to do what I'm doing. And so the young woman and I got crossways pretty quick. I was pretty clueless about relationships. But anyway, she left for Vancouver with a draft resistor, and I kept going to Monday night class. And when I came back to, I had to go back to Goddard because I was kind of playing tag with the draft board, but I kept finding ways to, get out to the West Coast under cover of Goddard College. And I wrote to Stephen, who I'd gotten his mailing address, and asked him if he knew of any. I'd helped on the Goddard that winter. We had this project and built a log cabin, and I felt like I knew something about carpentry. Didn't know much, but knew something. And I asked him if he knew any communities or rural communes that were looking for somebody to help them build something. And the day he got my letter, one of the people that he was close with said, hey, we're looking for people to help us rebuild our commune. We had a candle factory in our house, and the house burned down. And he handed her my letter. And that's how I got introduced to the House of the Seventh Angel and Elizabeth Gibbs, who was a kind of an important figure in the counterculture in some ways on the West Coast for quite a long time. She's gone now. But so I spent the summer of 1969 at the house of the Seventh Angel, living in the woods under a tin roof with no walls, up in the hills above Nevada City. And we never did get much of the house rebuilt, but we went to the what the heck was the river? We went to the river a lot and took a lot of LSD, and had a great old time. I came back to California that fall, and Elizabeth and the folks who had been there had kind of moved into a house in town. I stayed there for a while, and that she closed down that house. She was kind of independently wealthy and didn't mind, like my mother's age, and didn't mind being a godmother to a bunch of hippies, but she had her priorities. So anyway, I moved to a farm out in the woods and near Nevada City, and stayed there for the summer, and went to Monday night class every couple of weeks and the Sunday morning services, and I just felt like I was learning a lot, and I was very socially unskilled, but I seemed to be, connected with some people here and there. And it just felt like this was something that was building. As at this time, it's like most of the San Francisco hippie scene was falling apart just from being overwhelmed and underfunded. The Monday night class was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I felt like, wow, I'm onto something here. I joined a Goddard College project on the West Coast doing street theater. We put on Alfred Jarry's Ubu Ra and on the street in San Mateo, and I wasn't involved with that part, but everybody else got busted for it, and did a demonstration at one of the first San Francisco adult film festivals. Just did a bunch of kind of capers like that. Mine involved standing up in the theater, pulling my pants down and shining a light on my crotch and talking about what was there. But you can read about it. I'll think of the name of the book. Friend of mine, Sam Curson, wrote a book about that, which is really great. But anyhow, but Monday night class just kept feeling bigger and bigger and more important. And Stephen got invited to go to the West Coast, to go on a tour around the country. And most of the people who were closest to him left, and suddenly there was this big hole in my life. Let's talk about the Grateful Dead a little bit before we get past there, because
so you're talking about the caravan that precedes the founding of
yeah.
Since you're in the Bay Area a lot during that time period, and you've actually visited other communes, and you've name checked several artists, historical events, activism, and also the war in Vietnam. But you've also mentioned, like you just name checked, Herbert Marcuse, Norman O'Brown, Wilhelm Reich, all names very, very familiar to me. But I think names that people aren't talking about those authors or those books anymore. Even when I was coming up in the 80s and 90s, I had people of your generation who were always recommending Norman Brown and Wilhelm Reich, and in particular, you've talked definitely about the use of psychedelics. But yes, so talk about the music scene in San Francisco during all the times that you visited, and the Dead in particular, and then bring us back to the caravan time.
Okay, well, my first introduction to the Grateful Dead was via records, because I was in Ohio, and I'd been going along. I'd sort of gone from being really into 40s jazz to getting into Ornette Coleman and Charlie Mingus and people like that. And I didn't much care for rock and roll because it was just kind of simple and all about "Oh Baby, I Love You." I really enjoyed Frank Zappa quite a lot because he was coming from a different perspective. And I heard the first Grateful Dead album, which was a bunch of shortcuts and that one long one. And I listened to the shortcut and said, boy, these guys have some energy on. I didn't really know about their connection with the acid tests at that point. And then it got to Viola Lee Blues on the second side. And I was like, holy shit, this knocks Ornette Coleman into a cocked hat. This is just such an intense improvised music. Wow, wow, wow. And then, of course, their second album, Anthem to the Sun, was just like, this was just something totally new, It was like for a rock and roll band to just flow through two sides of an LP, it was like, wow. So I got out to California and didn't have a lot of money. Not that it only took like $2 or $3 to get into the Fillmore or the Avalon. And the first time I heard the Grateful Dead, they were the last band on a 5-band program at the Avalon. It was real late at night. I was starting to get a headache, and I'm embarrassed to say I walked out on them. But I heard them at the Carousel a while later, and they were just, wow, amazing. I didn't really get to hear them a whole lot. I did see like Quicksilver Messenger Service. Saw Santana playing on the back of a truck on the street in Berkeley back before he got famous, and he was really amazing. And so was a band called Frumious Bandersnatch that I thought was better than Santana, but nobody ever heard of them. And then the last time, then, I went all through Live Dead, which was just kind of this mind-blowing album of what, and then they entered into that phase where they were Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, where they were doing like these songs. And I was like, oh shit, they sold out. They lost their inspiration. What is this? And I saw them live at the time. It was one of the first bands that got to be on TV as a whole concert. And it was kind of the same as I did see them live once in that time period. And it was what turned out to be Janis Joplin's last appearance before an audience, before she overdosed and died. But she and Pigpen were up on the stage cussing out the audience for just sitting there and expecting to be entertained. And, I was trying to get up and dance and get things moving, and people were shouting at me to sit down because they couldn't see. And the Dead were not terribly inspired by that audience for some reason. But so it's like, I left San Francisco. Well, I ended up, I thought I was going to go back to Goddard and finish writing my senior thesis. But when I got back to Goddard, which Goddard was one of the stops on the Caravan. So I rode the Caravan to Goddard, and people were really into radical honesty, and I needed a stiff dose of it at that time. And I got it, and I got back to Goddard, and not only did everybody seem, kind of wimpy and immature, but somehow all the notes for my thesis that I'd mailed back had never arrived. To this day, I don't know what happened to those 4 notebooks. I guess the FBI has them. But anyway, so it's like there I was 4 weeks from when I was supposed to graduate with nothing, supposed to write a senior thesis, and this Caravan that meant everything to me, and a thesis that meant nothing. It's like, okay, what am I going to do? Write about the revolution or join it? So I dropped out of college and joined the Caravan with no clear idea what was going to happen at the end of it. You know, I know, well, I go back to California and hitch around until I find something. And had quite a long series of adventures getting back to the West Coast. Got back there and found out that the caravan had left for Tennessee to start a farm, which was kind of amusing because when my hitching partner and I, we'd gotten separated from the caravan, had gone through Nashville, somebody had told us, yeah, they said they were going to come back and start a farm. Why don't you all just stay here and wait for them to come back? We thought, nah, they never do that. And kept on going, spent every night in jail between there and the West Coast, including a week in the slammer in Arizona for vagrancy. And got back to the West Coast, and sure enough, they were heading for Tennessee. So my buddy and I started hitching back across country and caught up with them in Utah, and went with it from there. Like I felt like this was the only place in the country that I knew of that was like sane. Everything else just seemed crazy and pointless. So we went back in the woods in southern muddy Tennessee, southern middle Tennessee, and started figuring out how to build a community together.
You talked a lot about the vibes that were in the room at Monday night class, and the vibes around this was the people that you were looking for, and a little bit about Stephen's intersectionality with Eastern spirituality and the hippie movement. But I think for people who have, and I met Stephen a couple of times, Max, in the early 2000s when we were protesting the war in Iraq, and also when I started coming to the farm for some of the workshop. I went to several different workshops at the farm in the late 90s and the early 2000s. So I don't know how many times I've visited Summertown, but a few. But I think for people who are a little bit like out there, they can picture, when we talk about the Grateful Dead and Janis Joplin and Pigpen, people can conjure an image in their mind what we're talking about. Can you give a little bit more description of just what your friendship with Stephen Gaskin is like, and what Stephen Gaskin was like as a person? And I mentioned this to you warming up to this interview, Martin. I have not been able to really find anybody who really is willing to talk much about Stephen, and I think there's various reasons for that. And I've watched the Amazon documentary, American Commune, that talks about the changeover and stuff like that. But I feel like post-changeover farmies maybe don't really want to talk about Stephen Gaskin. And I want you to talk a little bit about, because he was, without him and without the caravan and without that initial instigation, I mean, we wouldn't be here. You know, you wouldn't even probably live in Nashville. I mean, you know.
No, I don't know.
And I kind of, even though I came more for Short Mountain than for the farm, I kind of wouldn't live in Tennessee if it wasn't for the history of hippies in Tennessee. Because I moved from a very vibrant bohemian enclave in Detroit, Michigan, to rural Tennessee 25, 30 years ago. And you were the first generation that laid that groundwork for those of us 90s hippies that moved here in the back to the land scene in the 90s. So give us a little bit more about just the pre-farm Stephen and the energy around him and the caravan and some of the, as he would probably say, some of the trips that he was laying down for you guys.
Okay, well, Stephen Gaskin was a little bit older than most of the people around him. He was a Korean War vet who came up, he got a master's degree in creative writing and looked like he was going to be more of a teacher than a writer. He was at San Francisco State and seemed like he was going to be S.I. Hayakawa's heir apparent. If you're not familiar with S.I. Hayakawa, he was a kind of one of the major figures in American linguistics, kind of like a little bit like Noam Chomsky, only right wing kind of. And Stephen started noticing that all his best students were dropping out and going to the Haight-Ashbury. And So we went and found out, followed what they were doing. And by the time, let's see, when I first started going to Monday night class, when I first came to his attention, we were meeting at Glide Church in San Francisco, because the San Francisco State had been closed down by the student strike and needed someplace else. And I would come in and I would play the piano, because there was a real nice grand piano in the room. And he asked me not to do that, because he wanted to be the one setting the vibes. And I said, okay, whatever, And so I did not have much of a personal relationship with him at that time, or really ever. He was just somebody I found very inspirational to listen to. I did at one point on the caravan kind of get up and say a bunch of stuff as if I was in charge when I wasn't. And it was meandering and hard to follow anyway. And he told me that, look, if anybody tries to talk to you and points a microphone in your face, be succinct and scintillating. Okay. He set the standard for the caravan that if you were balling somebody, you were engaged, and if you were pregnant, you were married. And I tried to grab that hot wire and got burned, without going into too many details. And let's see, when I was just like really horny and not very skilled at getting other people to be interested in my horniness. And so I just took a vow of chastity for a year. People would take vows on the early farm, mostly around people who were really into good food, saying, okay, I'm just going to eat brown rice for 10 days. And one guy who was Steven would put people on such yogis. Brown rice, 10 days. And one guy said something, and Steven said, brown rice, 10 days. The guy said, I'm already eating brown rice. And Steven said, okay, 10 days of Coca-Cola and ding-dongs. So he did stuff like that. He married, my wife and I, when I got her pregnant, and it was like, okay, I'm either going to have to marry her or leave. And I'm not going to leave. I just actually wrote an article about that for Communities Magazine, which is not available online, but I'm going to make it available at my blog, Deep Green Perspective, this coming month. Let's see, he was in jail for being for taking responsibility for our growing marijuana, which he had actually advised people against doing. And we went and visited him once there in 1974, which happened because we had a child who died at the age of 3 days. And, it was kind of a comfort to go be with him and his family and just kind of be in the vibe of some people who were taking care of business in spite of the fact that he was in jail. At the time of the changeover, we were actually pretty crossways with him, because he and his family were criticizing the way we were letting our kids grow up, which I don't know what to say about that. That's too involved a topic. But so we were kind of crossways with him for a while, and then had some conversations with him around 2010 because I'd been going on and saying, if we organize the community a little better, maybe we would have survived instead of getting all hung up and trying to maintain all the infrastructure we had to maintain for spreading out all over 3 square miles of land. And he said to me, you talk about we should have planned. I didn't plan. I just turned you guys loose to see what you do. And I was like, we had one chance to start the revolution and we didn't plan it. Okay. But yeah, then the next time I see him, he'd gone senile and he looked like a ghost of his former self. And he still had it together enough to recognize me. And he gave me a big hug, and I gave him as much energy as I could back, because he's the man that shaped my life. He always had something inspiring and insightful to say, even in the toughest of times. And next thing I heard, he was dead. That's a whole other story. But,
I follow counterculture. Like, this sounds too pretentious, Martin, and it's really not pretentious. But because I work for my day job at a college, I follow what basically we would call, counterculture studies. So I read books about communes. I've read countless books about the Grateful Dead. I read a lot about anarchism. I read a lot about deep ecology and the radical environmental movement and how it interacts with all these different things. And I was meeting with somebody here from Tennessee not too long ago who moved up here from New Orleans and who lives in my town and who's a part of a little bit of a radical. We formed a little bit of a radical group here in Cookeville, and they're wonderful. And this person's probably in their 30s, and they had never ever heard of the farm ever. It never crossed their radar. And I went and I got out my album. I don't know how many people own the vinyl albums of the Farm Band albums, but I own a lot of the
I don't have them anymore.
Well, I have both of the studio albums, and I have an album of Stephen's sermons that's like a gatefold album, and I that was like over $100 I paid for it anyway. But wow. I pulled out all of this weird like books and lore and just showed it to this person. And you could tell that something clicked inside this person's mind, like, oh, wow, that makes sense. That tracks. But one of the reasons why I invited you to do this live stream today, and why I'm going to ask people to watch it, and why I'm going to write all this up, is I think people have forgotten it. And it just so happened that the 50th anniversary of the farm came during the pandemic, and you guys have ragweed, but there was no like public facing there wasn't a lot of public facing acknowledgement of the farm's 50 years. Like, there was nothing on NPR, nothing in Rolling Stone. It just kind of came and went, Yeah. And I thought to myself, outside of the guy that's in Rising Appalachia, there's a farmie who's in a popular
Biko Cassini.
Yeah, outside of Biko and maybe Douglas and a few other people, it's like, and of course, people are getting older. Your generation are getting older. I mean, your days, in this incarnation are numbered, as all of our days in this incarnation are numbered. Like it's time to tell these stories. And I just wanted to, give you a platform. And this might be, part one of part two. But like, just as you were going through all of that, given all of the difficulties that happened over the years, you ended on this, your last hug, you and Stephen Gaskin's last hug. So what people get, I think, a little bit hung up. Would you say he was closer to like a general manager, a pastor, a guru, like what a spiritual advisor? Like, what common everyday language would you use to describe his role during the first several years there, from caravan to changeover? Like, what was his job in a sense? Was he the founding member? Like, was he the spiritual teacher? What was his role?
Well, he was the abbot of the monastery, or the monastery.
Okay.
That was part of our language. And it's like, there was a loose kind of spiritual hierarchy under him of people who were generally considered to have, pretty good judgment and a calm attitude and that kind of thing. Mostly the midwives. That, but it's like he would suggest things and they would get done that way. He was the one who bumped us from organic gardening to chemical farming, which I think was ultimately a really bad idea. But he would, so there were things he just allowed to happen, like the way the community was settled, which was kind of a suburban plan rather than all being together in, a tight little pueblo, which probably might have been a much better idea. People would go to him if they were having problems with their partner or other, he was like a counselor. It wasn't just him, it would be him and Ina May and Margaret. And it's a kind of an interesting marriage story because Stephen originally was married to Margaret, who was one of the students at San Francisco State College. And these days, that's a total no-no. But, it happened a lot. Like, and some of what's his name? Helen and Scott Nearing. Helen Nearing was one of Scott Nearing's students. And, they got hooked up in the early 20s and spent the rest of the century together. So, it's not like it's automatically a bad thing for teachers and their students to hook up. But anyway, so they were taking LSD with a couple named Michael and Ina May. Michael was a visual artist. And they ended up deciding that the four of them were a marriage. And then several other group foursomes in the community came to the realization that they could be married, or that they were marriages. There's only one of the people who was involved in that has written anything public about it, and he didn't say very much. Unfortunately, it's always something that I'm intensely curious about how the farm worked, and really can't say I know anything about.
Yeah, so nowadays people talk about ethical non-monogamy and polyamory, but there's also been a new fascination with the sectors of the Latter-day Saints that practice the Mormon lineage that practice plural marriage. There's been a lot of ink and a lot, and there's whole several documentaries and some of the specials that have gone on like cable television, like on Showtime and HBO. They've been quite salacious, about these. These poly couples bordering almost on pornography, some of it probably. And I think that that's a hard part of the story for us to grasp, but I think it was fully part of who y'all were. Because in some ways, some of the stuff you talk about Stephen being the abbot of a monastery, or about him giving guidance around diet, or saying that if you've had intercourse and you're pregnant, that makes you married. In some ways, that sounds very conservative, but a foremarriage doesn't sound terribly conservative even today. So,
well, they were strictly heterosexual foremarriages.
Okay. That I don't need to know.
The farm was in some ways socially conservative.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was asking about. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like I think a lot of that came from Ina May, who's, has since Stephen's death has actually become a born again Christian.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah,
cool. Okay.
Yeah. But she was very socially conservative. Our whole thing about don't have an abortion, come to the farm and have your baby, and we'll take care of your baby. If you ever want it back, you can have them. That came out of her opposition to abortion.
Yeah, so we don't talk about this kind of stuff in left communities with enough nuance today. So
Yeah.
like if you're not fully on board with LGBT, and I am personally for myself personally very trans and LGBTQ affirming, and that's one of the reasons I left my job. I'm a Christian adjacent. I'm into Jesus as a teacher and as the first hippie, right? But like my work with the Jesus lineage, I had to break off from them in part because of my overt support of LGBT in my own home church, even though the denomination I was working for, I worked for the Presbyterian Church USA, and it's a very LGBT, affirming group. And I think that today, with the way that you find a lot of hippies who are into Trump, like I think it's just very like everything's all cattywampus now, in terms of like us being able to have a nuanced discussion on the left about some of these things. And I don't even know, some of our progressive, you and I have talked about this before, some of our progressive friends aren't really progressive on core issues that we hold dear related to like ecology and war and the military industrial complex. So that's like that's another podcast, brah. Hey, we're going to wrap this up at an hour. So we've only got a few minutes left. Why don't you bring us back around to that? This is what I want you to do. Tell me the Grateful Dead story that you said you promised me. You tell me that related to you, Stephen, and the Dead, and tell me how many people on the farm do you think were actually Deadheads or came out of the rock and roll side of the counterculture? How much rock and roll kind of hippiness was in the early days of the farm, and just in terms of the way people dressed, the way they thought, because I think today, that's one of the things about the counterculture that is so strong is like, well, first of all, you guys were all into tie-dye and tofu, and tie-dye and tofu is so mainstream today. It's like unreal. And so I thank the farm for all their work with tofu and tie-dye. But what about the rock and roll aspects of the farm and how the Deadhead thing continued to live after y'all got to Tennessee?
Okay, well, there were a lot of people involved in the community and in Monday night class who were or had been in bands. It's a Beautiful Day. Worked with Stephen for a couple of years before they got really famous. Thomas Dotzler was in a couple of bands that were almost famous. He was Stephen's husband, so to speak. And we didn't waste much time getting back into rock and roll once we landed. I mean, we started out playing string band music and, doing square dancing and stuff like that. But it didn't take long before people were going up to the horse barn, which is the only place in the community that had electricity and enough room for a few people to play music with, electric music. And, we were dancing our asses off to electric music. And that was our communion. It wasn't just recreation. It wasn't mating dances. It was everybody getting together, communing in ecstasy with the music. And that's why our bands, took a lot of care with the words they said, and why we didn't listen to a lot of, commercial, quote unquote, rock and roll, or even to the Grateful Dead, who were known for telling grim stories at times. And I've caught to where I appreciate that. But that's one of the things. I think one of the spiritual errors we made was we were really into the light and didn't want to have to acknowledge the darkness. And the Grateful Dead are willing to acknowledge the darkness in their music and their lyrics. But, so we were really working hard on, as we said at the time, rock and roll was good for your soul. And it wasn't just about, oh, baby, I want you. That kind of music still bores the hell out of me.
So like Jesus, Martin, Jesus hippie rock and roll was coming up at the same time. And there was even Larry Norman had a song said, "Why should the devil have all the good music?" And I think, so were people on the farm, like critical of the Grateful Dead for dancing? For being friends of the devil, so to speak?
Yeah, for So I remember Stephen, late San Francisco times, criticizing them for being into guns and being cowboys, not being vegetarians. Um, I think we drew some very strict lines in the interest of defining ourselves. Um, I wanted to talk a little more about, some of those lines were our cisgendered insistence on cisgendered sexuality. It was the 70s. We were trying to get something across to mainstream America that was about simple living, sharing, just having a low impact lifestyle. And at the time, being gay was just like too much of a red flag of the bull for the mainstream. Um, I got no problem with it. People do what they want to do and make them be happy. But we were trying to craft something with mass appeal, and that involved being pretty strictly cisgendered. And that's why we did that. We got all kinds of people accusing us of, being sexist and homophobic and this and that and the other thing. And Stephen, one of his other mistakes was thinking that being gay was just some kind of ego trip. I think he was wrong about that. I don't know if he figured out he was wrong about it before he died or not, but a lot of what we did and didn't do was trying to get our values across to as many people as possible and turn off as few people as possible.
All right, when did you and Stephen go see the Dead together? You promised me this story.
Okay.
I've been waiting for a year for this story. Come on, bring it.
All righty. One of my friends on the farm was a deadhead, guy named Nick Hubbard. I say that because people send good energy out to him. He's not in great health these days, but he's still around. And Nick had been going to see the Dead. The thing about being on the farm was you didn't have any personal money. And the good news about that after we had personal money was you'd go do things if you had the money. And so Nick had been going off to see the Grateful Dead. And we had bought a really nice, big, roomy 1969 or so Chevrolet station wagon that could hold 6 people real easily. And Nick says to me, "Hey, the Grateful Dead are playing in Cincinnati. Want to go up there and see them? We split the gas 6 ways, and tickets were like $20 at that point. And I know somebody we can stay with, so we don't have to deal with a motel room." And so I said, sure. And I don't think his wife went, but my wife and I went up, and I don't know if there was a 6th person or not, but one of the people was Stephen, and one of the people was a single woman who was a member of the community that was, at that point in 1985, was still one of the people that liked to come down to Sunday services and listen to Stephen. That had got down to a couple of dozen of us from being the whole community. And so the 5 or maybe 6 of us headed up to Cincinnati and got to this Grateful Dead show. I'd been reintroduced to the Grateful Dead. I started working at a nursery here in Nashville doing day labor. And one of the women from Nashville that worked in the nursery had this little tape deck, and she was playing this music, and it was just the coolest music I'd ever heard. And I said, "What's that?" She said, "That's the Grateful Dead live." And I said, "Oh my God, they're back." Because I was like, I sort of just heard their records through the 70s, and there's nice music in retrospect, but nothing to write home about as far as way out jams. And so anyway, so I was primed to go hear this music live. And we went to Riverbend concert venue. It's this really nice park on the Ohio River. And there was, I don't know, like 20,000 people there. And the view I had from the farm was the counterculture was toast. And I got to this concert, and there's all these people and all this stuff. And I realized, wow, I'm not the last far out hippie in the world. I'm not even very far out as far as hippies go. And it just was a tremendously reaffirming experience for me. And music started. We were just kind of back in the audience. Stephen didn't make any attempt to go say hi to Jerry or anything. He was just happy to just be some guy in the audience boogieing. He was like 50 years old at that point, I think. Maybe a little under 50, 40 something. And so it was just a really great musical experience. And so we got out of the concert and went to the friend's house, and maybe it was Mario. Nick went off to a bedroom, and my wife and I started getting ready to go off to a bedroom, and Stephen and a single woman go off to a bedroom together. Okay, whatever. But next morning, she looked upset, and he looked embarrassed, and while he'd been really talkative on the way up, he didn't have much to say on the way back down. I never asked anybody what happened, but it's like as the Tibetans say, it's not a bad idea to live 3 hours away from your spiritual teacher, so you never get to see him with his pants down.
So the legend is, by the way, that show is on archive.org. You can go listen to it right now when we get off this call. And the set list is phenomenal. It was June 24th, 1985 and at Riverbend. And that checks out. And I've seen the Grateful Dead at Riverbend, I believe, twice. And everything in your story, once or twice anyway, everything in your story just completely checks out. It's a great place to see a show right there on the banks of the Ohio River. I mean, you guys got an Iko and a Tennessee Jed that day, a Let It Grow,
yeah,
a Wharf Rat, which is one of my absolute favorite songs. And it was getting close to 4th of July holiday season. They closed with U.S. Blues, which is, I saw my very last Dead and Company a couple days ago, and they closed with U.S. Blues in Charlotte just 2 nights ago. But you quoted to me in one of our messages, Martin, the lyric from the song Country Garland in the Wind and the Rain, wherever he goes, the people all complain. And that was kind of I think that was kind of your wink, wink. Like maybe the song St. Stephen is not about Stephen Gaskin, but it could be, right?
No, it couldn't be. Hunter wrote the lyrics long before Stephen was anybody in the San Francisco scene.
Okay.
But back in the early 70s, when Stephen was he was very critical of people. That's our spiritual method was to criticize each other intensively.
Yeah.
And so he'd show up at one of our satellite communities or someplace and muss up everybody's ego. And Ina May was the one who said, wherever he goes, the people all complain.
But the text is fluid, right? A Grateful Dead text is fluid. The Bible is fluid. The Bhagavad Gita. These texts are living documents, and so I think there is a connection between that song and the spiritual founder of the Summertown Commune. I think the literal connection needs to be obviously stated for factual people who are into facts. No, that's not the same thing. But just the way that you quoted that to me over Messenger many months ago, and then the way we just talked about it just now, I'm always going to associate those two, a little bit in my mind, And I think I did a show a podcast with Douglas a few years ago, and I'm pretty sure I probably played that song. And if I do end up importing our interview parts of our interview into a radio show, if I pull that off, I'm sure I'll play that damn song again. We're going to wrap it up at the top of the hour. I'm Andrew Sunfrog, teacher on the radio out of Cookeville, Tennessee. Martin, out of just west of Nashville, was in San Francisco and Goddard College in the 60s, and ended up on the Caravan, and ended up in Summertown, and has lived in Tennessee ever since. Martin, you mentioned Antioch and then Goddard, but you said Dayton, Ohio. So had you visited Antioch in the 60s at all? Did you go on the campus and
experience? Yeah. It was like, before I could even drive, I'd ride my bicycle out there. It was like 18, 20 miles away, and browse the beatnik bookstores. That's where I got my first Incredible String Band album. That's actually where I first heard the Grateful Dead for the first time. It was in Yellow Springs.
So I attended Yellow Springs for 1 year in 86, 87. I dropped out, but the place is extremely dear to my heart. The Glen Helen Nature Preserve, and just and there's a guy who owns a bookstore in Yellow Springs who was part of my generation of Antioch students, and he's a deadhead, and the name of the bookstore is Dark Star. So there's Dark Star Books right there in the little village there in at Yellow Springs, and I really got turned on. I took my first tab of a psychedelic at Antioch College as a very young person, and I got really, my mind really was changed by the 1 year I did have at Antioch. And I actually dropped out. I actually had a psychedelic. I had one of my first bad, I wouldn't call it a bad trip, but one of those kind of like turn you inside out, upside down, all around.
A learning trip.
What?
A learning trip.
Yeah, I had a learning trip, exactly, on Halloween 1987. And I packed up and went back to Detroit, and I actually never finished. My parents ate the bill for my incomplete semester, forgave me for that. They didn't shame me for that, and I re-enrolled at Wayne State University. So, did you ever finish your Goddard? Did you ever go back and finish?
Yes, I did. My mother really wanted me to. I said, if you pay for it, I'll do it. And so I got into their adult degree program, and in the late 80s, early 90s, and wrote a paper about the history of the farm, wrote several hundred pages about the history of the farm, which remains totally unpublished and not online. It's one of those things I've been going to do for 20 years now, 30 years, 20 years I've been online. I read it every now and again. I say, yeah, I still agree with this, and maybe one of these days I'll get to it. But so I wrote about putting the farm in the context of what the earlier ideas I had of Marcuse and Eastern philosophy and all this, and criticizing it, somewhat. And since then, I've become more aware of the role that COINTELPRO might have played in the downfall of the community. I wrote about that in several pieces called Edward Snowden and the Farm, available on my blog. I wrote about that 2013, 2014 or so.
Did you, one really quick, and then we're going to wrap this up. I'm Sunfrog. This is Martin. This has been a great hour. This has been a treasure for me, and we might have to do it again. But thank you for anybody who listens to this, who listened to it live or is listening to it on YouTube or later archived somewhere else on my website. Martin, were people being allowed to leave and going to rainbow gatherings? Were people leaving the farm and attending rainbow gatherings, or were people leaving rainbow gatherings and coming to the farm?
There was some traffic from rainbow gatherings, but our motto at that point was 3 days of the rest of your life. We weren't into casual stuff. We weren't into rainbow gatherings. I went to my first rainbow gathering sometime, in the early 90s. And again, it was like going to the Grateful Dead show. It's great. There's lots of far out hippies, and I'm not very far out. But I really like being settled and being part of something that has to assemble itself and disassemble itself every year and only gets to stay for a couple of months is just not my style. So I want to be someplace.
Yeah, I get just in terms of my own research and my own kind of predisposition. I'm just really curious about how the Grateful Dead subculture, the communes subculture, and also the nomadic kind of traveling hobo, you know, thumb out, hitchhiker, rainbow, drainbow. They call some of them drainbows because they're not productive. They're more got their hand out,
Yeah,
you know. So, but it's all very, I think it's all connected. And I think that we need storytellers for these this lineage to continue. And that's when I was messaging you earlier, I like this term lineage, because I feel like even though I was born in '67, I feel like I'm in your lineage. I'm connected to this, and I'm meeting, you know, because of my job, I meet, you know, 20-year-olds all the time who occasionally one of them is really curious, you know, about this side of our lives, and I want to be able to be a competent storyteller to share some of these legends and lineages with the young people who are in their 20s, who are inheriting this planet that's climate change, the political, the whole thing. I mean, it's what a mess we're in. But that'll be a topic for
yeah,
another day.
yeah. I really have a lot of heartache because I felt like I really gave my life to trying to make this planet a better place and make it someplace sane where a culture that would last and nourish people. And it's really up in the air about whether that's going to prevail or whether we're going to totally trash the place and extinct ourselves.
Yeah, I mean,
And most other life forms along with us.
just today on Democracy Now, they said the potential for malign AI robots taking over the world is a clear and present danger. That was on Democracy Now today. that the AI robots are an existential threat to the future of the human race. So,
Well,
hey,
Democracy Now is saying it. My God, they've gotten so conservative and mainstream. I hardly even bother to listen to them, but that's the best news I've had about them in a while.
they've been on top of some stuff. They really criticized the Biden, how Biden sold out, you know, student debt and the Mountain Valley Pipeline. They had some really good coverage. I don't listen every day though, because I find it ultimately very depressing. But when I do listen, when I do listen, I gain a lot from it. But anyway, we've kind of kept this more on the cultural than on the political side, and that was my decision, my choice. Martin, we're going to wrap it up. We're past an hour. I love you as an older brother, and I'm grateful that you were willing to give me your time today.
I really appreciate you being curious about what I have to say.
Yeah, this has been awesome.
Hope other people can benefit from it.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And
Love you much. I'm glad we finally managed to do this.
Yeah, thank you so much.